The Crimson Fields of Elaine, a Requiem for Justice. The year was 1919. The place, Elaine, Arkansas, a small, unassuming town nestled amidst the fertile cotton fields of the Arkansas Delta. In the aftermath of World War I, a wave of racial tension swept across the nation, fueled by economic anxieties, returning black veterans demanding their rightful place in society, and a resurgent Ku Klux Klan. The Elaine Massacre, a brutal episode of racial violence, stands as a stark reminder of this turbulent era, a testament to the deep-seated prejudice and injustice that plagued the American South. The massacre, triggered by a confrontation between white law enforcement officials and black sharecroppers seeking better economic opportunities, resulted in the deaths of hundreds of black men, women, and children. The events in Elaine were not a spontaneous eruption of violence but rather the culmination of decades of systemic oppression and economic exploitation. This is the story of the Elaine Massacre, a story of economic injustice, racial prejudice, and the long and painful struggle for justice that followed. Part 1, The Shadow of the Plantation, Life in the Arkansas Delta. To understand the tragedy of the Elaine Massacre, one must first appreciate the realities of life for black sharecroppers in the Arkansas Delta. The Delta region, characterized by its rich soil and reliance on cotton cultivation, was a place of immense wealth and opportunity for white landowners but a place of poverty and exploitation for black laborers. Chapter 1, Sharecropping and Debt Peonage. Following the abolition of slavery, black residents of the Arkansas Delta were forced into a system of sharecropping, a form of agricultural labor in which farmers worked land owned by others in exchange for a share of the crop. The sharecropping system was inherently exploitative. Black sharecroppers were often charged exorbitant rates for rent, supplies, and credit, trapping them in a cycle of debt peonage. They were unable to escape the system, forced to work year after year for little or no profit. White landowners controlled every aspect of the sharecropping system, from setting the price of cotton to determining the value of the sharecropper's labor. They often cheated black sharecroppers out of their earnings, leaving them with nothing to show for their hard work. Chapter 2, Systemic Discrimination. Black residents of the Arkansas Delta also faced widespread systemic discrimination. They were denied access to education, healthcare, and other basic services. They were barred from voting, serving on juries, and holding public office. The legal system was rigged against black residents. They were often arrested on trumped-up charges, subjected to unfair trials, and sentenced to harsh punishments. White law enforcement officials often turned a blind eye to violence and intimidation against black residents, further reinforcing the climate of fear and oppression. Chapter 3, The Seeds of Resistance. Despite the hardships they faced, black sharecroppers in the Arkansas Delta were not passive victims. They formed mutual aid societies, churches, and other community organizations to support one another and to resist the injustices of the sharecropping system. They also began to organize politically, seeking to challenge the dominance of white landowners and to demand equal rights. The Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America, a black organization that advocated for economic justice and political empowerment, gained a significant following in the Arkansas Delta. The growing resistance among black sharecroppers alarmed white landowners, who feared that their economic and political power was being threatened. Part 2, A Gathering of Souls. The formation of the Progressive Farmers and Household Union. The Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America, often referred to as the Union, was a crucial element leading up to the Elaine Massacre. This organization, comprised of black sharecroppers, sought to challenge the exploitative economic system that trapped them in poverty and debt. Chapter 4, The Visionaries. Robert L. Hill, a charismatic black preacher and labor organizer, was instrumental in founding the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America. Hill, recognizing the need for collective action, envisioned an organization that would empower black sharecroppers to negotiate fair contracts with white landowners. The union promised to challenge the exploitative sharecropping system. It aimed to pool resources, challenge unfair practices, and demand fair compensation for their labor. Black communities were hungry for change. The union quickly gained a significant following in the Arkansas Delta, attracting thousands of members who were eager to fight for economic justice. Chapter 5, The Union's Aims. The union's goals were modest but revolutionary for the time. They aimed to negotiate fair contracts with white landowners, ensuring that sharecroppers received a fair share of the crop proceeds. They hoped to pool their resources to purchase land and equipment, allowing them to become independent farmers. They also sought to challenge the corrupt accounting practices that were used to cheat black sharecroppers out of their earnings. The union's activities, though peaceful and legal, were viewed as a threat by white landowners, who feared that their economic power was being challenged. Chapter 6, A Meeting at Hoop Spur. On the evening of September 29, 1919, a group of black sharecroppers gathered at a church near Hoop Spur, outside of Elaine, Arkansas. They had come together to discuss their grievances and to plan a strategy for negotiating with white landowners. The meeting was peaceful and orderly. The sharecroppers discussed their concerns, shared their experiences, and debated the best way to achieve their goals. Unbeknownst to the sharecroppers, their meeting had been infiltrated by white spies, who reported back to local law enforcement officials. Part 3, The Spark of Conflict, a shot in the dark and the escalation of violence. The peaceful meeting at Hoop Spur was about to be shattered by violence. A confrontation between white law enforcement officials and black sharecroppers would ignite a wave of terror that would engulf the entire region. Chapter 7, The Confrontation. As the meeting at the church drew to a close, a group of white law enforcement officials arrived on the scene. The officials, acting on false information, claimed that the sharecroppers were plotting an insurrection. A confrontation ensued. Shots were fired, and a white law enforcement official was killed. The exact circumstances of the shooting remain disputed, but the incident served as a pretext for the massacre that would follow. Chapter 8, The Call to Arms. Word of the shooting spread quickly throughout the white community, inflaming racial tensions and triggering a call to arms. White residents from surrounding towns descended upon Elaine, determined to suppress what they perceived as a black uprising. The white mob, armed with guns and fueled by racial hatred, began to hunt down black residents, indiscriminately killing men, women, and children. Chapter 9, A Reign of Terror. The Elaine massacre was a brutal and systematic campaign of racial terror. White mobs roamed the countryside, targeting black communities and killing anyone who resisted. Black residents were hunted down like animals, shot in the streets, dragged from their homes, and lynched from trees. Their bodies were left lying in the fields as a warning to others. The violence was particularly brutal and senseless. Black men were castrated, women were raped, and children were murdered in cold blood. Part 4, The Fog of War. Accounts of the massacre. The exact number of black residents killed during the Elaine massacre remains unknown. Official estimates put the death toll at around 200, but many historians believe that the true number was much higher, possibly exceeding 800. Chapter 10, The Official Narrative. The white authorities, seeking to justify the violence, claimed that the black sharecroppers had been plotting an insurrection and that the massacre was necessary to restore order. They portrayed the black residents as bloodthirsty savages who posed a threat to white society. This official narrative, repeated in newspapers and historical accounts, served to sanitize the violence and to deflect blame from the white perpetrators. Chapter 11, The Black Perspective. Black survivors of the massacre offered a vastly different account of events. They testified to the brutality and senselessness of the violence, describing how they were hunted down like animals and subjected to unspeakable horrors. Their accounts, often suppressed or dismissed by white authorities, painted a picture of a community terrorized and destroyed by racial hatred. They spoke of the fear, the loss, and the enduring trauma that the massacre had inflicted upon their lives. Chapter 12, Eyewitness Accounts. Eyewitness accounts from both black and white residents provide a chilling glimpse into the events of the Elaine massacre. One black survivor recalled seeing a white mob dragging a black man through the streets, beating him mercilessly. Another survivor described hiding in the woods for days, fearing for her life and watching as her community was destroyed. White residents, in their accounts, often minimized the violence and justified the actions of the mob, claiming that they were simply defending themselves against a black uprising. Part 5, The Legal Farce. The Elaine 12 and the Fight for Justice. Following the massacre, white authorities rounded up dozens of black residents and charged them with inciting violence. These black men, known as the Elaine 12, were subjected to unfair trials and sentenced to death. Chapter 13, the show trials, the trials of the Elaine 12 were a travesty of justice. The black men were denied adequate legal representation, subjected to coerced confessions, and tried before all-white juries. The trials were conducted in a climate of fear and intimidation. Black witnesses were threatened and prevented from testifying on behalf of the defendants. The trials were a foregone conclusion. The Elaine 12 were quickly convicted and sentenced to death, their fate sealed by racial prejudice and political expediency. Chapter 14, the NAACP intervenes. The NAACP, led by Walter White, recognized the injustice of the trials and intervened on behalf of the Elaine 12. The NAACP hired a team of lawyers to appeal the convictions, arguing that the trials had been unfair and that the defendants had been denied their constitutional rights. The NAACP's intervention brought national attention to the case, exposing the injustice of the Elaine trials and galvanizing support for the defendants. Chapter 15, a victory for justice. After years of legal battles, the Supreme Court ruled in Moore v. Dempsey, 1923, that the trials of the Elaine 12 had been fundamentally unfair and that their convictions must be overturned. The Supreme Court's ruling was a landmark victory for the NAACP and for the cause of racial justice. It established the principle that all defendants, regardless of race, are entitled to a fair trial. The Elaine 12 were eventually released from prison, their lives spared by the Supreme Court's intervention. Part 6, Suppressed and Remembered. The Legacy of Elaine. The Elaine Massacre, though a significant event in American history, was largely suppressed for decades. The story was whitewashed, minimized, or outright ignored by historians and public officials, a deliberate act of erasure that compounded the injustice of the massacre itself. Yet, despite the efforts to bury the truth, the memory of Elaine persisted within the black community, passed down through generations, a painful but vital link to their heritage. Chapter 16, the Unspoken Truth. In the immediate aftermath of the massacre, a shroud of silence descended upon Elaine and the surrounding areas. White residents, many complicit in the violence or fearful of its consequences, rarely spoke of the events. Black residents, traumatized by the carnage and wary of further retribution, were even more hesitant to discuss what had happened. The official narrative, promoting the idea of a justified suppression of a black insurrection, dominated public discourse, effectively silencing dissenting voices. This deliberate suppression extended to the historical record. Early accounts of the events often downplayed the scale of the violence, minimized the role of white aggressors, and perpetuated racist stereotypes about black residents. School textbooks and local histories omitted the massacre altogether, perpetuating a sanitized version of the past. This silence, however, did not mean that the memory of Elaine faded. Within black families and communities, the stories were shared, whispered across generations, serving as a constant reminder of the injustice and the ever-present threat of racial violence. These stories became a part of the cultural fabric, a source of both pain and resilience. Chapter 17, the rediscovery of Elaine. The late 20th century witnessed a growing movement to uncover and acknowledge previously suppressed chapters in American history, particularly those related to racial violence and injustice. This movement, fueled by the civil rights movement and a growing awareness of the need for historical accountability, paved the way for a re-examination of the Elaine massacre. Scholars, journalists, and activists began to delve into the archives, conducting painstaking research to uncover the truth about what had happened in Elaine. They interviewed survivors and their descendants, meticulously documenting their accounts and piecing together a more accurate picture of the massacre. These efforts gradually brought the story of Elaine to a wider audience, challenging the official narrative and prompting a reassessment of the events. The rediscovery of Elaine was a crucial step towards acknowledging the injustice and honoring the memory of the victims. Chapter 18, Seeking Reconciliation. The renewed attention on the Elaine massacre sparked a debate about the need for reconciliation and redress. Black residents and their descendants called for a formal apology from the state of Arkansas, recognition of the victims, and efforts to address the lingering effects of the massacre. Some white residents, acknowledging the injustice of the past, expressed support for these efforts. Others, however, resisted calls for reconciliation, clinging to the old narratives and denying the extent of the violence. the debate over reconciliation highlighted the deep divisions that still existed within the community and the challenges of confronting a painful and complex history. Part 7. The Power of Memory, Healing and Hope in the Wake of Tragedy. Despite the enduring challenges, the story of Elaine offers a glimmer of hope. The efforts to uncover the truth, to acknowledge the injustice, and to honor the memory of the victims have paved the way for healing and reconciliation. The rediscovery of Elaine is not just about remembering the past, it's about learning from it and building a more just future. Chapter 19, Honoring the Victims. One of the most important steps towards healing is to honor the memory of the victims of the Elaine massacre. Their names, long forgotten, must be remembered and their stories told. They were not just statistics but human beings with lives, families, and dreams that were tragically cut short. Memorials and commemorations can serve as powerful reminders of the past and provide a space for reflection and healing. The creation of a permanent memorial at the site of the massacre would be a fitting tribute to the victims and a symbol of the community's commitment to remembering the past. Chapter 20, Educating Future Generations. Educating future generations about the Elaine massacre is essential for ensuring that such tragedies will never happen again. The story of Elaine should be incorporated into school curricula, allowing students to learn about the history of racial violence in America and the importance of fighting for justice and equality. Education can help to break down stereotypes, challenge prejudice, and promote understanding between different racial groups. It can also empower young people to become agents of change, working to create a more just and equitable society. Chapter 21, The Enduring Strength of the Human Spirit. The story of Elaine is ultimately a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. Despite the horrors they endured, the Black residents of the Arkansas Delta never gave up hope. They continued to resist oppression, to fight for justice, and to build a better future for their children. Their resilience and determination serve as an inspiration to us all. Their story reminds us that even in the face of unimaginable adversity, the human spirit can endure, and the dream of a more just and equitable world can still be realized.